going to be talking about repairs in NYCHA public housing, who we are, why we're here. We're a part of New York Legal Assistance Group's Public Housing Justice Project. We are the first legal services team that was exclusively dedicated to the rights of public housing residents. We primarily represent NYCHA residents who live in developments, although we also do a little bit of Section 8 work as well. We were started when Right to Counsel was implemented at the NYCHA Office of Impartial Hearings, which is where a lot of NYCHA residents have either grievance hearings or termination hearings. So it's important that folks got lawyers. We've expanded to do a lot with repairs and community clinics and things like this. And Sophia is an addition to our team who is specializing in repairs work specifically. The one additional preamble that I have is that NYCHA for the first time has made all of their policies and procedures in one place and public. That is called the ACOP, or the Admissions and Continued Occupancy Policies. Up until a year ago, NYCHA residents who wanted to understand the rules of their housing did not have access to that information. If you were ever wondering, my HA, my manager, told me something, it doesn't sound right, you can now look that up and confirm what NYCHA's policy is supposed to be. It's a really useful tool for helping make sure that your management is following the rules they're supposed to be following. And if you ever have a question about something you'd like to do, get a dog, have a roommate, those sorts of things, those procedures are all in the Admissions and Continued Occupancy Policy. This link is a little wild, but I will say if you Google NYCHA ACOP, it is the first thing that pops up. So getting repairs in your NYCHA apartment, this is going to be a massive overview. Every individual case gets a little tricky, but if you're at the point where you're like, I've got an issue in my apartment, I don't know what my next steps are, this can hopefully get you started down the right path. So if NYCHA is refusing to address repairs, you have a couple of options. We're going to go through all of them. Filing an HP action in housing court, contacting the mold ombudsperson call center, or requesting an accommodation or a safety transfer if the repairs are impacting your ability to use your apartment due to a disability. Before we get into escalating, just have to make sure we cover the bases. Before you escalate an issue to court or to the mold ombudsperson, you need to make sure you've put in tickets. We understand deeply that tickets are not effective, that NYCHA management offices are well known for closing tickets before they've tried to rectify the issue, of losing tickets from manager to manager, of just leaving tickets open forever and never following up. We understand, but if you want to effectively escalate a repairs issue, you do want to be able to show, and you'll need to show, in fact, that you alerted NYCHA to the conditions and they still failed to act. And the way that you can show that is through a record of your ticket. So if you submit it on the portal, keeping that screenshot of the confirmation. If you are calling them in, make sure you're writing down the ticket number that the CCC will give you. And if you're going to the management office, making sure you're taking that ticket number, or otherwise making a record of that conversation with management.
HP's in housing court. So HP actions are housing court cases where essentially you as a tenant can sue NYCHA for failing to meet the housing maintenance code. So essentially not keeping your apartment habitable. You can file an HP action at your borough housing court, and we have the address for Manhattan on the slide. The court will schedule an inspection from HPD, which is the city agency that does housing inspections, and a future court date, and you need to be available for both days. The HPD inspector will come to your home, make a list of all the violations of the housing maintenance code that they see. So you also want to make sure to direct their attention to any violations you think exist in the apartment, and you'll use that inspection to prove in court that NYCHA isn't following housing law and try to legally force them to make those repairs. They can require patience. You have to wait in between court dates. They'll frequently adjourn them, which can take time, but they can be an effective way to get NYCHA to make repairs. It's very important to go to all the court dates for your HP case. You'll usually meet with the NYCHA attorney to schedule access dates, so you want to go in with a sense of your own availability. I've also noticed that having pictures of repairs that have not been completed, especially when NYCHA has not shown up for access dates that they previously promised, or they've come and not fully repaired, you want to come in with pictures and a really comprehensive list of what still needs to be fixed so that you can have less back and forth with the NYCHA attorney if they try to tell you that something's been repaired that hasn't been. And then if NYCHA fails to make the order repairs, you can return to court to ask the judge to hold NYCHA in contempt. If you do get to this step, it also might be worth giving us a call at our hotline to see if that might be something we can assist you with.
Another really frustrating part of the process is often you have to provide availability over and over, and NYCHA will fail to show up. But it is key to keep providing that availability, because defense in HPs for landlords is always that the tenant failed to provide access. So you want to make sure you are keeping your case alive by continuing to be available, even though we understand that it is wildly frustrating to stay home or to have someone stay home and for NYCHA to fail to show up over and over again.
Also, on that note, it's a good idea to keep track of any personal losses or harm that you're experiencing during the HP process. So if you have to stay home from work and you lose wages, if you have to hire childcare, something like that, keep a record of all those costs, because if you do get to the stage where you hold NYCHA in contempt, you can try to recoup some of those costs as damages in that court action.
Another avenue that is unique to NYCHA residents right now is the mold ombudsperson. There was big litigation against NYCHA for chronic mold issues, and as a part of that settlement, they were required to appoint an ombudsperson to address the chronic mold issues. This is a third-party organization that handles repairs specific to mold or moisture. It's a separate intake process. They're separate workers from the folks who work in your NYCHA development, and anecdotally, we've seen a lot of success. We have a relationship with the third party that is running the Ombuds call center, and if we refer somebody, they follow up with us a couple days later if they weren't able to get in touch with that person. So they're moving pretty fast. I would say the limitation is that it needs to be those mold or moisture issues, but I would recommend that folks try to define that broadly and let the Ombuds call center tell you that they won't take that kind of case. Don't self-select yourself out of the opportunity if you think this is a route you'd want to take. The complaints are pretty easy to submit. They have a web portal that you can do it on, but you can also call live agents who speak at least, I know, English and Spanish, are available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. If you submit a complaint on the portal, they can allow you to upload photos. If you do a complaint with a live person, I've known them to do video tours of the apartment if there's an accessibility concern with letting folks in within that time period. Their standard practice, though, is that they do respond promptly. They schedule a home inspection, and then they try to start the repairs as soon as they can. We see that the most for mold, we'll see it for chronic leaks, and that can sort of include structural damage that has come from minor leaks. Also worth noting that sometimes repairs do require relocation. We do see the ombuds major mold issues, especially if you're breaking into walls, is going to require often relocation. If you are ever concerned about relocation, you want to talk through what that process looks like with somebody, our hotline is a good resource for that. We've had clients who've been relocated. We know it can be really frightening to leave your apartment and then just have to trust you'll be let back in. So we can talk folks through that as well.
I recently learned this from an advocate on our team who does a lot of these referrals. You need to have a mildew specific ticket open for 14 days before you can submit a complaint to the ombuds. So make sure you have that mildew specific ticket in.
I do know that they cannot open a case if there's not an open ticket. So the time period was news to me. So this is another instance where, like, yes, tickets are useless in the sense that, like, NYCHA often ignores them, but they are useful because think of them as sort of your entry fee to these better options for repairs. I want to touch on reasonable accommodations. And another route available to you, especially if a repair is preventing you from utilizing your home due to a disability, is to request a reasonable accommodation. NYCHA is required by law to engage with you if you request a reasonable accommodation. In some instances, that can mean a transfer. Maybe it just means they finally take notice of the repairs and do them. A good example of that is if the elevator in your building is constantly out, you might qualify for a reasonable accommodation for a disability. But also, if someone in your house has a chronic illness that's being exacerbated by, like, construction dust or leaks, you could qualify for a reasonable accommodation transfer on that basis as well. So again, it's one of those things where we'd recommend never talking yourself out of your own qualifications. Present your case to NYCHA, and if they say no, you can push back, you could call us, or you can try a different route. But I think if NYCHA is failing to make the repairs and you are a person who would qualify for a reasonable accommodation, that is absolutely a route that you should consider, because those are words that trigger a legal obligation to a landlord. Housing managers are taught to escalate that to make sure that they're in compliance with the law.
It's worth noting you could do this along with a different route.
Absolutely.
Transfers, even when they are approved medical transfers, can take a while. So you can always put in for a transfer and still pursue the ombuds or an HP.
NYCHA's official policy is that they don't settle HPs for transfers, but if you're doing both at the same time, you may as well try to use them to leverage each other. The one thing about reasonable accommodations and transfers is that transfers are totally an internal process to NYCHA, which is most mostly to say that we as lawyers can't really intervene in that process. There's no entry point for an advocate to step in and say, sue over a transfer denial or something. But those forms are available at the management office and on the portal. NYCHA is really moving towards wanting everything done on the portal, but they are still being required to keep paper copies of everything. So if tech is not your jam and you'd feel more comfortable doing it at the office, they have to let you do that. It is helpful to include medical documentation that can support your request. That can be from a doctor, that can be from a therapist, that can be from any health professional. NYCHA doesn't limit it to MDs. And again, you shouldn't count yourself out of eligibility. So if you have a professional that you're working with that can support your claim, go for it. And then unfortunately, transfer requests take time. Like Sophia was saying, we still recommend filing tickets, keeping a paper trail of the issues in your apartment, and considering HP actions for orders directing NYCHA to make the repairs, even if your long-term goal is to transfer out of that unit.
I just wanted to briefly talk about asbestos and lead, as they are obviously both really dangerous to residents' healths. Asbestos is a dangerous mineral that was commonly used in construction decades ago. It has fire repellent properties, but then it was discovered that it can be incredibly harmful when you breathe it in. So essentially what happens is when the asbestos fibers become loose in the air, you can breathe them in and they can lead to really serious health issues over time. Various materials in NYCHA apartments were originally created with asbestos-containing materials, primarily seen in the floor tiles. It's also on insulation on pipes and on the surface coating on the ceilings. So if you ever see your floor tiles are cracked, if your ceiling is peeling, you want to make sure that you get the apartment tested for asbestos so that it can be remediated. And you should definitely report it. You can also give us a call on our hotline. That's something that we're definitely able to help with, is the remediation. And as Miles mentioned earlier, asbestos almost always requires a relocation. So we can also help you advocate during the relocation process. It usually takes around a month that you'll be relocated. It can take longer if it's in conjunction with other repairs. Lead paint is also present in NYCHA apartments. It can be dangerous for residents, especially children. Lead paint tastes sweet to children, so they're often attracted to it, especially very young children, and will lick it, which will get it into their bloodstream, which can be very dangerous. So if you notice that the paint in your apartment is peeling, cracked, or loose, you should contact our hotline. You can also contact NYCHA directly to try to get that tested. Lead paint peels in a very specific way. That could be worth looking up just to educate yourself to try to get a sense if the paint in your apartment is lead. There's also several different reporting requirements that you as a tenant have, including if you have children under 6 in your apartment and you want to make sure that you're fulfilling all those obligations, because it might move you up on the list of people waiting to have lead remediated. And then I just wanted to add that there's a lot to say about both of these materials. It has pages on both of them that talk more thoroughly through your obligations, and might just definitely be worth looking at if this is something you want to learn more about.
I want to flag in general that most of this was NYCHA specific. If you are not a NYCHA resident, HPs are still available to you and you don't have the ticket requirement. You should let your landlord know, but then you can file an HP. At the bottom here, we have the 2 ways to make a hotline referral for us. We have our phreferrals at NYLAG email address, and then our hotline number is 212-946-0353. It is a voicemail box, so if you leave a voicemail with a callback number, name, and just a brief description of the issue, we'll get back to you. Give us a little bit. It is mostly the 2 of us answering these calls, and so we just get a little behind sometimes, but we will get back to everyone. So that was like a breeze through the basics of how to escalate a repairs issue.
So pests, infestations, rodent, and otherwise are violations of the Housing Maintenance Code. When you file an HP, they'll ask you to list out really specifically the conditions in your apartment that you want repaired. You should definitely include that, and the inspector will almost always include that as a violation. Violations are put in classes. They can be an A, B, or C level violation, and that corresponds to how many days a landlord has to make that repair. So often those are actually higher class violations and definitely worth pursuing. So I would definitely try an HP if you're having trouble once you file it, kind of getting anything done. That's like a great time to give our hotline a call.
If you are losing food to mice, those are the expenses that you might want to note as well. If you get to a contempt point, or if you want to file what is called a notice of claim, you can sue NYCHA for money in small claims court. Because NYCHA is a government agency or a government actor, before you sue them in small claims court, you have to file what is called a notice of claim, which is sort of when you alert the government, like, hey, I'm going to sue you, you owe me money. You just have to do that. You can get those at the county small claims court, or there are usually forms you can Google that are just like, here's a notice of claim form, but those have to be served on NYCHA NYCHA within 90 days of the incident. So if you have like a massive flooding leak in your apartment and you lose your couch, you lose your bed, you lose a bunch of clothing, if there's some incident that causes you to lose a lot of belongings, we would recommend filing a notice of claim right away with an estimate of how much property you lost. Once you've filed that notice of claim and serve it on NYCHA, and then you will get a stamped copy or you'll have your own copy that shows you served it, you then have a year to actually bring a court case. The tight timeline is that 90 days after the incident. And oftentimes folks are coming to us and it's beyond that timeline. And you can still file it. You can still try to make an argument that NYCHA should give you money. We've known NYCHA to offer to settle with small reimbursements, and then it's up to you whether you want to pursue larger. Again, those are not cases that we can take, but if you have a question about that, I can walk you through that. If your HP has been languishing, to give us a call. So repairs can also come up as defenses in non-payment cases. If NYCHA is suing you for having not paid your rent, if any landlord is, you can bring up repairs as a defense to that and request what's called an abatement hearing, where you're asking the housing court judge to take notice of how bad the conditions were in your apartment and give you a discount on your rent because of that. On that front, I'd say that we never recommend withholding your rent, just because I personally, if I set aside my rent amount and I promised myself I wouldn't touch it, I would touch it. I would spend it on something else. And so technically that abatement, you're supposed to have set that rent aside to be able to assert the abate defense. You're technically supposed to have it. Realistically, we do see folks get to make abatement arguments even if they aren't in that exact moment good for the whole amount that's left. We do recommend paying your rent and bringing an HP is a more effective way to make those claims than to wait until you're in a non-payment case and bring it as a defense if you have the choice. If you are truly unable to pay your rent because you're spending money compensating for repairs, if you have no stove, so you're out a lot more than you would, then you have the option to bring up those repairs issues in a non-payment, and you should do that. I will say that the steps can be simple, and each individual case is what makes it complicated. So hopefully this is enough to just recognize what some next steps are, or like we've been saying, like the points in which it would make sense to call and talk to a lawyer, and we're available to counsel through the next steps in an individual repair case, because only y'all know the complicating parts of your whole life that would make a case one option easier or harder or whatever.
And it's also worth noting that there's a lot of policies in New York City that make it especially difficult for NYCHA tenants to achieve repairs. NYCHA tenants aren't allowed to call 311 the way that private tenants are, as an example. So NYCHA tenants are required to file an HP action in order to get a court judgment to get an inspection done in their apartment. So I also want to validate that it's a system that in many ways is made to prevent people from getting repairs, and it's very valid to need assistance navigating a system that is truly set up to be frustrating. So please call us.
Legal services attorneys who take city contracts to do repairs cases are explicitly prohibited from representing NYCHA tenants. So we have Sophia because she's on a fellowship, but our regular grants do not allow for HPs for NYCHA residents. So we also train pro bono folks to represent NYCHA tenants in those issues as well. So there is a massive unmet need, and we're doing our best to help fill it. And some of that, unfortunately, is resident empowerment information rather than just saying, show up, we'll take all your cases. We've done clinics in the past with our colleagues at Legal Hand in the East Harlem site there. We also have our mobile legal health unit, has different sites around the city, and they refer cases to us as well. So if you ever see that New York Legal Assistance Group is coming somewhere, feel free to come try to get connected with us.